All right, I think we're going to get going. Just everybody should know this will be recorded, so that should be easy if you miss the first few moments of it. We just didn't want to have a lot of, hey, Kevin, nice to see you, man. We just didn't want to have a lot of dead time at the beginning of it, so we're going to just get going here. And my name's Carl Binder, and I'm CEO of the Performance Thinking Network, and I'm joined by Barbara Buckland and John Skank, and we'll introduce ourselves or sort of give you a little background shortly. But this is our second free webinar, and it's about sales enablement. It's about an area where actually each of the panelists here have a lot of experience, and I'll talk about that a little bit later. But it's a special application of performance thinking that in some ways we've sort of gotten back to, and we're very excited to talk about it. So let me proceed here. So one of the things before we get into it is our next webinar is going to be November 18th. And if you're on our mailing list, you'll get the update for it. And it's called Relationships as Valuable Accomplishments, which might be kind of a funny topic. You can see at the bottom of the screen there, it says, let's have a little fun with it. And we did this at our 10th annual Summer Institute in 2019 before our 11th got canceled due to COVID-19. And we did have a lot of fun with it because if you think about it, relationships, both in your personal life and also professionally, are a big accomplishment. We work to establish and maintain them. And so that's what November 18th is going to be about. And we'll be sending out the information about that in the coming days or weeks. And then here's some of the other topics we're going to be addressing in our monthly webinars. We're going to have one on leadership and management, at least one. Actually, there's a bunch we can do in that topic. We're sort of expanding part of our business to serve organizations and companies that work in applied behavior analysis. And so we're working with Shane Isley, our colleague in that area, and we're going to have a session that Shane and I will do probably first of the year. And then we want to talk about our coaching approach, which is different. It's accomplishment-based. We'll make some reference to it today, and I think John might have a couple things to say about it. We'll talk about agile talent development, and there will be other topics here, but just for the future, that's kind of the menu that we're starting to work on here. We also are very interested in your letting us know what you might like to hear about. So we welcome your feedback and also requests for topics. So you can email us at webinars@sixboxes.com, and that'll come to our manager of special projects, Joanne, and also to me. So we'll take that into account as we sort of build our plans over the next months. So I'd like to do a little poll, and let me go to that. And I'm going to start the poll. And all I'm wanting to ask here is what kind of what's your sort of role in your organization or as a consultant? And so I'm just going to publish this here, and all we're going to ask you to do is click off which of these categories or other that you are in, and hopefully you can see this now, and we'll see who we have in the room. So we got a performance consultant, we know that, and a C-level sales executive, all right, and vice president, some other folks. This is cool. We got some others, and VP of Director of Sales Training. That's a big part of sales enablement for sure. And let's see if we've got any other people filling this out. Looks like right now we've got mostly performance consultants and some others, probably in a variety of roles. And we've got at least some C-level folks, which is exciting. And keep going here. Please click off your poll. We'll let it run now for another few moments here until it sort of goes dead on us. So I think that's pretty much. So this is very interesting. We've got a lot of performance consultants. I'm going to end the poll now, and I think you should be able to see the results. Can everybody see the results? Can you guys, John and Barbara, can you see the results of the poll?
I don't see them. I don't know if John does.
I do not.
Oh, that's very interesting because I'm still learning about Webinar Jam, but my understanding was because I flipped a certain thing, you should be able to see the results. And I guess I still haven't mastered that part of the technology. But what we have here is quite a few performance consultants. We have a few people in the VP or Director of Sales Training category. We have some C-level sales executives, and we've got some other. And so not sure what the other are, but that gives us a sense of who we're talking to. And of course, one of the things about this is we will record this and it'll be available on our YouTube channel, and we'll follow up with an email so everybody will get it. So if you have colleagues involved in sales enablement that you would like to share this with, you'll be able to do that very easily. So moving right along then, I want to tell you a little bit about each of us. I know some of you because I can see your names in the chat box, but let me tell you about my own history. I've been a performance consultant for shockingly 45 years now, and I've worked a lot in sales enablement. Had a company in Boston, Product Knowledge Systems, back in the late 80s and 90s, where we focused exclusively on sales performance. And we actually did our biggest thing was to help with major product launches at companies like Genentech and Microsoft and Chase Manhattan Bank, and big companies where it really made a difference to ramp people up rapidly. And so that's been an area of interest of mine for years. We've also worked in customer service and a lot of other fields, but in the last few years, we've been sort of coming back to this area of sales enablement because we have a lot to offer, I believe. And by the way, I met John when he was my client many years ago. We've known each other for a long time when he was Senior Vice President of Sales at Dun & Bradstreet. Barbara, who you'll be hearing from, is a longtime colleague also. I've known Barbara for, I think, 20 years. And when she was a graduate student, and I was kind of an advisor to her master's thesis. And then Barbara was head of instructional design at a training company that did a lot of sales enablement in industries all the way from medical technology and pharmaceuticals to, retail sales of automobiles and in between. So she has a lot of experience in the area of performance analysis and instructional design. And she and I have been working together on a bunch of projects in the last few years. And then John, old friend and colleague who's working with us now, former Senior Vice President of Sales at a big company, has been a sales leader and an advisor and contributor to our work for years. So that's who we are, and we'll talk a little bit more. Each of us will have a little bit of a panel discussion toward the end. This is the agenda we want to follow. We want to ask the question, and I'm going to do a little presentation here, and then we'll have some discussion with the panelists and so forth. But we want to ask the question, what is sales enablement? Because it's a word or phrase that's been around for a while. And then we want to give you a really quick overview of the performance thinking approach, which you can get more on if you go to our YouTube channel at performancethinking.tv, or if you were in our previous webinar, which is posted on the YouTube channel, which was all about performance thinking. And then what we've observed over the years, based on our experience, is that there's lots of mistakes, but there's two big mistakes that we perceive in efforts to do sales enablement. And we want to highlight those. And then we want to talk about how we bring the tools and models of performance thinking to bear on those issues. We'll have a little bit of a panel discussion where I'll ask my colleagues, John and Barbara, some questions and see where that goes. And then we'll share some resources with you and hopefully have some Q&A with you all, our audience. So, there's a question here, what is sales enablement? Because this is a phrase that's been around a long time. And a lot of people, I think it's a new thing. But I will tell you that back in the 90s, when we were deeply embedded in that, and it was sort of pre-internet, or just as the internet was emerging, and there were software systems like Lotus Notes, and then there were early internet applications. The term sales enablement was a thing, but it was basically a software marketing phrase. It was a new name for a category of sales enablement of software, which involved things like marketing encyclopedias, what we now call customer relationship management software, and so forth. So it was pretty specific to technology then. But over the last decade or so, it's really become a thing. It's become a field, a topic, and a discipline. And it still, frankly, is very much of a software category. But depending on where you work and what your perspective is, it can include a lot more. And so there are departments of sales enablement. There are job titles that involve sales enablement. There are publications. And believe it or not, there are 233 LinkedIn groups with the phrase sales enablement in them as of a couple days ago. So it's a big topic. But frankly, it's still pretty poorly defined. It's pretty incomplete. And from our perspective, there's a lot that we can add by taking a more systemic approach. It's growing. For example, there are data out there and published in Talent Development just this month saying that there's 7% higher win rates if sales enablement professionals use a sales platform. It's basically a pitch for the software. 5 years ago, there were only about 14% of big companies that had a defined sales enablement team. Now there's 62%. And 66% of those companies have budgets dedicated to sales enablement, and 30% of those, it's $100,000 or more budget. And so, as they say, pretty soon we'll be talking about real money. People are investing in this. And whatever it is, if it's software and other stuff, we might ask the question, what's the return on investment? What are we getting for it? What does this actually deliver? And what we would argue is that, first of all, you can optimize the return on investment by driving continuous performance. And what we want to talk about is how we apply the performance thinking approach to do that. So as a little kind of overview and introduction into our history as performance consultants and performance improvement professionals, each of these men were important influences on me, were important mentors and teachers, and they sort of all add up to what we have now in a certain way. Dr. Skinner was my advisor and professor at Harvard in graduate school, and of course many of you know he was essentially the creator of a natural science of behavior. Tom Gilbert, who at one point was a postdoc with Skinner, but had his own whole career as one of the founding fathers, really, of performance improvement, he talked about performance engineering. And as you'll see, core elements of what we do with performance thinking trace back to Tom. And then Joe Harless, who was also a mentor of mine and really had a big influence on our work, was a protege of Gilbert. But what he did is he took some of Gilbert's key ideas, especially the focus on accomplishments, as you'll hear about a little bit later, and made them more replicable, made it something you could deliver. And then Neil Rackham, who was also a doctor, but was deeply embedded in sales performance. Back when I was a co-founder of Product Knowledge Systems in the early 90s, we worked with Neil and his company. He was the creator of what's called spin selling, that some people think is sort of old-timey, but Neil, we worked together on product launches at places like Microsoft and Chase Manhattan Bank. And Neil started out as an academic and professor in England, but I still think, probably did more. He and his team interviewed and observed something like 40,000, if you can believe it, sales interactions over the course of quite a few years, and really taught me a great deal about sales performance. And there's been lots of sales training and sales models since then. But if you combine what Neil brought to the table with these other gentlemen, you come up with big influences on our work. So I always like to give credit to those people. Now, you can learn a lot more about performance thinking from our last webinar if you see the recording, or from our from our courses, from our materials on our website. But fundamentally, it's a simple approach that integrates a lot from the field of performance improvement with two simple visual models and, as we say, 21 plain English words. It's a thing that allows us to analyze and improve performance, allows us, especially because of the plain English aspect of it, to communicate across functions and levels so we can build communities that have a shared language. And that's one of the big attractions in many companies. And that will drive collaboration and continuous improvement to accelerate results. And we think, and we've observed, this is especially powerful as a thing in sales enablement, because in sales enablement, you typically have people from marketing, and operations, and information technology, and sales training, and other functions, which have the potential of being essentially silos. And if there's a shared language and framework, it will drive collaboration among them. Now, I mentioned Tom Gilbert, and this is really a key to our approach to sales enablement. He published a very important book 40 years ago called Human Competence, Engineering Worthy Performance. And people in the performance improvement world know this book very well. There's a lot in it, but this quotation is sort of, to me, one of the nuggets. He says, in the great cult of behavior, behavior itself is viewed as an end rather than as a means to an end. And he doesn't just mean behavior scientist types. He means managers, leaders, trainers, everybody who's looking at performance tend to focus on behavior. But his point is, as he says in the second part, we must enable people to produce accomplishments, the valuable products of behavior. And so as we move forward in this presentation, I want to connect up this concept with the way we approach sales performance, because we focus on the accomplishments of salespeople, not just their behavior. And so we use the term work outputs, or the phrase work outputs, to mean accomplishments. And in sales, those are the milestones and progress indicators that people achieve along the way toward closed deals or repeat sales. So we have a way of thinking about performance then that has these three elements. We say it's behavior, of course, by people, that produces work outputs that are valuable because they contribute to business results. And this is often framed and easily communicated as an athletic thing. And we like to use soccer because we have global clients. And so people in places like Dubai and India and Europe know a lot more about soccer than they do about some American sports. So we tend to use this soccer girl, who, of course, if that were animated, you would see she's behaving. She's kicking a ball. Well, what's the output or the accomplishment? Well, it's a ball in the net. It's a work output. And that's what Tom Gilbert called accomplishments. And why do we care about that? Well, in a game, you can, in a pickup soccer game, you can say, well, we're trying to win the game. In professional soccer, you can think it's literally a business result, but that's what we're talking about. If you produce those work outputs, it contributes to winning the game. It contributes to your score. So that framework is a way to think about performance. It defines the elements that when we're analyzing performance, we need to be clear about. We need to be sure what the business results are. That is why we're even doing this. We want to be sure what people and processes produce that are valuable, that contribute to those business results, the work outputs. And then we want to understand what the best behavior is. In the case of sales, it's typically strategies and tactics for achieving those work outputs. So we have this first model, and we call it the performance chain. And it really just takes what you just saw a moment ago and puts it into a simple model. And we can step through this, but of course we start with the end in mind. We want to be sure that we know what we're trying to accomplish here. So business results are where we really start the conversation. And you can see those examples: product sales, revenues, share of customer profits, customer satisfaction. Those are all things that a sales organization, a chief revenue officer, a company is trying to accomplish. And many of those are, of course, the product of sales efforts. If you move back from that, there's a whole lot of work outputs that contribute to those business results. And that's just a short list. For a salesperson, it might be territory plans. It might be a list of needs for a given prospective customer. It might be an account plan. It's introductions. How do we get introductions? It's, if you're in the medical devices world, as a lot of our work has been recently, it might be access to operating rooms where you can work with the doctor, or relationships with staff, or scheduled lunch and learn sessions so you can go in and educate people about your products, or invitation to present at seminars, or etc. There's a whole long list of work outputs. And again, in sales, we think of those as milestones. Once we've identified those, there's all these different kinds of behavior we can identify. But what's important is we know what they're trying to accomplish, which is that they're trying to produce the work outputs. And finally, there's all that stuff that we refer to as behavior influences, which is a really long list. All the things that either exist or that we produce or design or implement to try to support the behavior, to produce the work outputs, to result in business results. Now, just to highlight this thing about the work outputs, these are the kinds of things that salespeople, sales performance are involved with. And it's a much longer list than that. And as you'll hear, when we go to work with a given client or a given organization, what we want to do is understand for their product in their market with their environment, what actually is the successful sales process? What are all the big and small outputs? Again, we call them milestones and progress indicators. So we anchor our analysis in what salespeople are trying to achieve, because that's what produces the business results. And it's also that is what the most successful salespeople produce through their behavior. Now, what influences behavior? Well, we have this model that's derived from Tom Gilbert's behavior engineering model, and we call it the 6 boxes model. Actually, one of my late friend and colleague and late colleague of John's named it because we were developing this model from Tom Gilbert's model we were coming up with plain English for the categories back in the early 90s. And at one point I was stumbling over the description of this and saying, well, it's based on Tom Gilbert's behavior engineering model, but you can see that it's different language. And Tom Hogan said from the back of the room, why don't you just call it the 6 boxes? You're always referring to boxes. So that's how it got its name. The point is that this framework, which on the surface of it is very simple, as a trained behavior scientist, and also as an experienced performance improvement professional, I have yet to find anything in almost 50 years that influences performance that does not fit into these categories or relationships between them. And when you sort of blow that out for sales, you see that all the things we do to support sales performance can be sorted there. Now, I hope this is big enough for you to see on your screen. If it's not, hopefully you'll get the idea, but this is just a subset of the things that we do to support sales performance. And once we've defined those milestones or those accomplishments, and we know what behavior we're trying to support, we have to have all of these things fit together, work together. And this is really where the ROI optimization comes in, because you can just scan this and you'll see there's a lot going on. And if we define sales enablement as just a few of those things, like maybe a tool like the software, maybe training and skills and knowledge, maybe a couple other things, we've only got part of that system. And our view is that we need to look, and the 6 boxes model gives you a way to do that, at all of the things that are supporting sales performance so that we can make them work together. And we'll come back to this a little bit. The trouble is, in most organizations, these things come from multiple departments or silos. And I've worked on enough product launch teams to know that when you get the marketing communications people and the sales technology people and the sales training people and the managers and probably a bunch of other folks, the product specialists, into a room, and you start getting them talking about what it is they're going to do to support sales performance, let's say in this new product launch, they're often kind of disconnected. They're not often really lined up around the actual performance that's required. And so what we think is, and what we know for sure actually based on our quite a lot of experience, is that we can coordinate these things that these folks do. We can collaborate. We can drive continuous improvements if we have a framework that pulls it all together. And that's what we think performance thinking will do and does. So if you put the 2 models together that I've just given you kind of a whirlwind tour of, the way we approach performance in any context, including in sales, is we start out being sure what we know what the business results is. For example, if we're helping salespeople produce proposals, we need to know if those sales proposals are focused on profits or if they may be focused on market share and we're willing to have loss leader deals. Maybe we're just trying to expand our market share, and we're actually willing to sell for less than our cost for a while, in which case the proposals need to be built to sell, not just to be profitable. So we need to know, using that example, what business results are. We then identify the work outputs. And again, in sales, we refer to those as milestones and progress indicators. And we want to be sure we understand how they contribute to business results. We then look at the behavior. And in sales, that's tasks and tactics, strategies and tactics. What do people have to do to produce those? And as you'll see, what we do is we try to look for the stars, the top performers, and extract as much of their best practices behavior as we can. Once we know those 3 elements, now we can select our measures or our KPIs. Now we know what we can measure. We can look at business results. They might be lagging indicators, but we certainly want to look at them. We can look at behavior. We certainly want to know if people are doing the right things. But frankly, the most important things are the work outputs, the milestones that move any given case from sort of initial prospect to final deal. And so we now can select our measures. Once we're in place with that and that's all lined up, now we can look at the behavior influences. And that's where that systemic approach comes in. We want to optimize the conditions that support sales performance. We can interview people. We can find out what's working for them, what's not working for them. We can engage them in a coaching process that tweaks that on an ongoing basis. And we can basically implement and monitor and continuously improve it. So in the simplest terms, this is everything I know about performance, but let me tell you a little bit more about how we apply this in sales. First thing is this approach works across functions, levels, and silos. As we've been starting to say recently, it's a superpower. Performance thinking is a superpower. It's a way to think about performance that is really flexible. But if we look at sales enablement as a field, as a area, we think there are two really big mistakes that almost every company we've looked at makes. And the first one is that they don't really define their successful sales process. So what I've seen in a lot of companies is that they come in with some sales training model that they got from a book or a training company, the Challenger sale or spin selling or whatever, Miller Heiman, whatever it is. And they say, well, we're going to do this. And it's often very behavior based. But what we need to know in your market, for your people, for your products, first of all, what are the milestones and progress indicators? What are the things that you need to achieve as a salesperson day to day, week to week in your account, your territory to close deals? And then what do the best people do? What are the exemplary strategies and tactics, the behavior of your star performance? And so the first thing that people don't do a very good job of, in fact, my experience is they hardly ever do it at all, is really define their successful sales process. And a lot of our work as consultants is we get called into companies who say, can you do this best practices sales process thing for us so we really know what's working and so we can build our solutions to that. And then the second problem is that sales enablement is incomplete and disconnected. It's not a system. It lacks the systems viewpoint that the 6 boxes model brings to the table. There's missing elements. People just, they pull a couple levers. They do training, and then maybe they do marketing programs, and then maybe they pay people a lot or whatever. I mean, that's oversimplified. But I'm sure if you look at your own organization's sales efforts, you will see there's lots of other things that you could align and coordinate to make it more effective. And I think the last bullet there is particularly important, which is that as in most areas of performance, there tends to be an overdependence on training. There tends to be an awful lot of, we're going to put them through sales training and get them ready for this. And, Barbara and I have worked on ramping up and field training things, and we see, oh my gosh, people go through a lot of product training. So maybe they can talk about products, maybe they can talk about features and benefits, but they don't really know how to apply that necessarily on the job. They don't really know how to use that knowledge in the context of the milestones they're trying to achieve with a given client. And then coaching is a thing which everybody can acknowledge, I think, in most companies, is not used very effectively. And I think there's two reasons for that. One is that a lot of companies have not invested in developing their managers as coaches or creating a cadence of coaching or making that a coaching culture. But the second thing is an awful lot of coaching is behavior-based. It's like, you should deliver the message, you should ask for the sale, etc. I got to know what I'm trying to achieve first. So how about if we build coaching around accomplishments, around milestones? And we'll talk about that a little bit later. So we think these two things there's a lot of other mistakes you can make, but if you don't do these two things, you're handicapping yourself, frankly. So one of the ways we think about this, and I've referenced exemplary performers, but we try to capture the upside potential, what Tom Gilbert actually called the potential for improving performance. And so if you look at a sales force and you look at their performance based on outcomes, based on actually milestones and ultimately revenues, you may not have a normal curve like this, but you typically have some top performers, some stars. And in most of the organizations we worked in, there's a handful of people, if not more, who sell a lot more than average. And then you've got some good solid performers, and they kind of make the belly of that normal curve. They're sort of at the average. And then sometimes you have poor performers, and a lot of times they take up a lot of time from sales management, problem solving, and that's true in every area of performance. What we try to do is, first of all, notice what the upside potential is. And what we mean by that is, how much difference is there between the outcomes and the results that the top people accomplish and the average people? Now, sometimes you can account for that difference based on, well, they've got the primo territories or whatever it is. But more often, you recognize that there's some people that are just a lot better. They have a lot more effective strategies and tactics. And so what we're trying to do is to sort of take advantage of that difference, because as Tom Gilbert pointed out, the bigger the difference between the best performers and the average performers, the more opportunity there is to improve. So what we try to do is say, wait a minute, if we can capture some of the strategies and tactics of some of our best people, if we can continuously improve how we support sales performance, we're not going to make everybody the LeBron James of sales, but we can move the average up. And that ultimately is worth a lot of money. It's worth a lot of sales. And so the way we approach this is a series of steps. We first of all, as I mentioned, we anchor performance analysis in the milestones and progress indicators that salespeople have to achieve. And we learn that by talking to the salespeople, by saying, what are you trying to achieve next? And we get not just big ones, but little ones, like receptionist gives me his cell phone number. Well, why is that an accomplishment? Well, that's an accomplishment because I can call that person if I happen to be at Starbucks and order some stuff for the folks back at the office and come in and extend the meeting in their seminar room about my product, for example. And of course, they're big ones like request for proposal. So we start out with, what are the milestones in your sales performance? We then take a look at exemplary performers, and we interview them and we observe them, and we try to capture some of their strategies, tactics, and tools. Now, there's this myth, I believe it's a myth, and I'm going to ask John about it later, I think, but what I've heard, they always say, well, they'll never tell you their secrets. My experience is if you interview exemplary performers one-to-one, they'll tell you a lot of what they do. And you may not get everything, but you'll learn a lot about what they do that's different from average. And then you can harvest that, and you can drive performance up for the average folks by incorporating some of those best practices in your training, in your coaching, and so forth. And then the other thing is, once you know what that behavior ought to be, you can put together an integrated system, all the stuff working together. So that's kind of the logic of how we approach sales performance. And when you pull it all together, this is just one page from a thorough analysis that was done at a biotech company a few years ago. We did it, and this is just what, 1, 2, 3, like 5 or 6 milestones out of about a whole bunch from one particular sales force that was selling a particular product to doctors. And notice these milestones and work outputs at the far left. Cell phone number of a person in the office, I just mentioned that. People in the office, especially prescribers who can talk about your key messages. Relationship with the prescriber. How do you develop a good relationship with the prescriber? An advocate, a person in the hospital or wherever it is who can talk about your stuff and is a fan. Relationships with other folks who will give you the inside information. Relationship with an individual who can influence a prescriber. Now, that's just a small set of outputs. But if you think about it, if salespeople's efforts and our training and coaching are focused on those things that they're trying to achieve and all the other things, then we can move things forward instead of just saying, you should behave like this. It makes a big difference. And then the rest of this analysis is criteria, like what does it mean? How do you know when you've got this? And then you'll see under the behavior column there, and this is just a few of the best practices and strategies and tactics that we got, in this case, through interviews. And then notice that last column. That's because this is a part of a coaching tool where people can begin to identify stuff that I need to get a little bit better at developing advocates in my accounts because I haven't done a very good job of that. How can I do that? And if I'm a good sales manager who knows how to coach, I can probably help. So again, we're back to this system because we've emphasized the importance of milestones and progress indicators, but then to get that return on investment, what we need to be able to do is combine all these things. Be sure they're all working in the same direction. Be sure, for example, that our software isn't so clunky that it has a built-in unexpected or unintended consequences of discouraging salespeople from using it. I can't tell you how many companies I've been in where you talk to the salespeople and they say, yeah, they want us to use that app, but it really sucks and it doesn't work. Or you go in and they say, the marketing department keeps sending us these programs and videos, but they don't understand, they don't work, they never ask us. So, those are just simple ways that if we look at all the factors that support performance, we can actually make them work together. And that's the idea, that we're trying to build a performance system here. So to summarize those 2 big mistakes I mentioned, failure to define your best practices in sales process. How do we do it? We focus on identifying the milestones and progress indicators that are successful in your market for your company for your products. And then we capture and share exemplary behavior from stars. Once you got that, you've got a foundation for training, for coaching, for content, for tools. And then the second thing is we got this problem of misaligned and incomplete and partial sales enablement systems or components. Well, the 6 boxes model gives you a really nice framework for being sure you're complete and that the stuff all hangs together in a system. And that gives you a foundation for continuous improvement, because you can be sure these things are working together. Be sure that, for example, instead of taking people away for a 3-day training, which takes them out of the field, which costs a lot to develop, well, maybe we could provide the manager with a couple coaching tools that would help them get up to speed, and some job aids, be a lot more effective cost-wise, and wouldn't take people out of the field, just as one example. So this gives us a framework for continuous improvement. This is the shameless commerce part of this presentation, but this is, if you go to our website and look at our programs, you'll see those 3 that are the ones related to sales performance. We have a thing called the Performance Thinking Coaching Program, which is designed to turn managers in a lot of roles into coaches, and we can do that for salespeople. The focus would be on milestones, of course. And then the Performance Thinking Practitioner Program, which is something we do inside of companies to teach people how to do performance analysis and design interventions, but we also have an open version of that every couple months. And then Performance Thinking Sales Enablement is kind of a customized service that Barbara and I and others can bring to bear, helping an organization do what we're talking. So the point of this webinar really is to provide some insights for you, but this is how we help address them if you're interested. So coming back to, that's kind of the end of what I have to say. And what I wanted to do is to get John and Barbara involved a little bit here. We've got about 25 minutes or 20 minutes left. And so I want to leave some time for you all too. And looking at the chat box, there's some nice conversations going on, although I think a lot of you are seeing each other. So I wanted to ask John. John, as I mentioned, was Senior Vice President of Sales when I met him at Dun & Bradstreet, and has a pretty long history of being a seasoned sales leader and kind of wise person. And John and I have been talking about sales enablement for a couple of years now and what this term means. And I want to ask you, John, when you see that term out there, like, what does it mean? What do people mean by it these days?
Well, Carl, it's really evolved. I think the first time I ever heard of the phrase was in something you wrote back in 2009. I never even heard of sales enablement.
Oh my God.
And then sometime around 2016, I realized that this part of sales is emerging and really becoming, vitally important to an entire organization. So I started to do a lot of research and joined the Sales Enablement Society and started to network with people to understand what is it. Because when I looked at the definition back in 2016, very well-meaning person, it looked like it was 3 paragraphs long. Everything from, content to training to technology. And I went, wow, if I tried to really put this together, it would take me about a month. So then as this evolution has taken place, you start to, condense it and get it down to what it really is. So I think over the period of time, 4 years, let's say, a lot of things have evolved, especially the technology. But even the definition, I may be paraphrasing it, but the definition that it's really a process of assisting, a sales team to efficiently move a buyer along the sales process to a buying decision. And it's utilizing all of those other things we've talked about in sales technology and that. But that's really, in essence, what it is. It's getting to the buyer, to the decision process, and then closing the agreement. So then those things in that evolution, has really, made the people involved start to grow within the organizations, and in fact, start to build out those, departments, so to speak, into sales enablement groups that could provide all of that information to the sales teams so they could effectively move their conversation with the buyer. And so, it's really, really evolving. You look now, and I can only use the Sales Enablement Society that, where they started with very few people, they now have 8,000 members in 59 countries.
Whoa.
So it's taking hold, and it's becoming really important throughout the world, but definitely here, how do we move that? How do we define it within a company? Because only, as you mentioned, I think you said only about 63% of companies have a sales enablement function. So I think there's still a lot of room for growth.
So just to follow up on that, I'm a little cynical about this, I suspect, because people tend to think sales training is the answer to everything. And then they think, technology is the answer to everything. And what I'm wondering is, as you look at that, what are the disconnects? Like, what are the things that are missing and the things that aren't kind of, like, for example, I shared that 6 boxes view of it. Like, what do you think is not happening or is disconnected?
Well, I'll first lead off with the sales technology side. When you look at the sales technology stack and you realize that there's such a reliance on technology, especially now that we are retooling our sales teams to produce in an environment that we have, one of these virtual environments. So when you look at that first call and you say, what is our reliance in building the skill sets of our sales reps? You look at technology first, and there are over 800 sales training, as a lack of a better word, technologies to help the sales reps navigate through the entire, sales process and buying process. When you look at 800 of those, and you look at an industry that's due to grow within the next number of years to $5 billion, there's a great reliance on technology, as there should be. And I think just a woman I know through LinkedIn, Nancy Nardin, she creates every year one of these sales technology landscapes. And it's a way to look at all the technologies in all of the different categories, largely behavioral based, that sales enablement groups are utilizing in order to put together a very robust, content management and training and development and onboarding process. So, when you mention the disconnects, it's really putting that all together and having less of a reliance, in my opinion. You need it for the technology, but in order to really make it useful for the business, is you have to look at it from a senior leadership. And if senior leadership is not giving their full support to the sales enablement function, then I think that's a major, major disconnect. You end up having, an interpretation within sales enablement of roles and responsibilities. So when you have senior leadership totally behind it, number one, and number two, perhaps the sales enablement group creating a charter, a business plan for their group, so they were able to align all of their disparate groups, formerly in silos, into some strategic group that starts to be scalable and then contributing to the business results. So, in essence, it's really senior leadership, they're getting on board, and you actually have a charter, a business plan within the group.
One of the things that I've been saying for a while, we actually have a little YouTube video about it, the notion that senior leadership in sales or new head of sales training or people who are relatively new in the role, one part or other of sales enablement, sometimes have a kind of a honeymoon period where they're expected to make big changes. And I guess my view has been that what you just described is something that could be done. You come into a new organization and you say, there's all these disparate different groups that are trying to support sales, and yet they're kind of disconnected. And there's some stuff that's kind of missing. And let's see if we can look at it in a framework. And of course, I would suggest the 6 boxes model, but let's look at a way to integrate it. Because to me, a lot of this is parallel activities that are not very well aligned with one another. Does that ring true for you also?
Yes, it does. And I think in a January article in CSO magazine, the person alluded to the fact that we could be going into a recession. If we go into a recession, what happens to the people we have? And he was talking specifically to the sales enablement function. And lo and behold, we have the pandemic. And then we have things happening. Here we're building it up. I told you we have up to 8,000 people who are just members, LinkedIn members, as you mentioned, in just a sales enablement category. And then you're finding that we are forced into a bit of a recession, and companies are starting to downsize. And in that downsize, they start taking people away from a very vital group in sales enablement, because they feel they have to. And that's why one of these people in the article talked about sales enablement should really be looked upon as a discipline. You actually mentioned it in one of your slides.
Mhm.
And if you look at it as a discipline, it's a business within a business. And if someone was to run, let's say, a whole sales enablement group, and they start to look at it as a discipline, they start to create some strategies for the group, and then building on, an ROI into the group and what contributions they make to business results.
Yeah, one of the things about that that sort of makes me think is that I've known people who were in sales training and they were very influential, or I've known people who were in sales leadership roles, like VPs of sales are often our clients.
Right.
And I've also known even product marketing people with major products, or sometimes sales operations folks. I think right now in some organizations, any one of those people could begin to be a change agent to bring things together in a coherent framework. So I got one more question for you. I don't want to use up all of our time here, but I know you and I've talked a lot about coaching, and one of the things that I've seen is that some organizations have a coaching model that they try to get their managers to use with their salespeople, but a lot of times it's very behavior based. And one little story I can share with you, actually, Barbara and I both had this experience. We were interviewing people who were top performers, and this was a company where they had this behavior-based coaching thing. And so the manager would come out and ride with the salesperson, and they'd have a checklist, and they'd say, are you delivering the message? Are you doing all these other things? Behavior. And when we talked to the sales guys, they said, when the manager comes out and rides with us, we do what she wants us to do, and we follow the thing, and we do the list. But frankly, when the manager's not here, we're trying to get to the next thing. We're trying to work on what we call milestones. They had different words for them. But I'm wondering if you look at coaching and you think about the difference between a behavior-based approach and one that's focused on sort of the milestones or what you're trying to achieve. As a sales leader, what's your perspective about that?
I think the low-hanging fruit is working on behaviors, right? I mean, we have, and I'll use the technology again, if we're able to look at dashboards and all the technologies we have, and we start to realize, how many of our reps are involved in self-learning, right, and self-paced learning. They may be involved in role-playing. They may be involved with, the sales cadence, and all of these things that as a sales manager, you're able to look at what this person is doing. You tend to coach to that activity. And then, so I often think that if that's indeed what we're coaching, and I think sales coaching is probably the biggest part of any business, but if they're just looking at the activity, they're not looking at what that activity should be going to produce, as you mentioned, like work outputs. And I think about a very early role model to me, or somewhat of a mentor, and even someone who I like to say is an influencer, even though I only met him once, but I've read everything and studied him very closely. But when you look at Coach John Wooden of the UCLA basketball dynasty, he always said, do not confuse activity with accomplishment. Yeah. Here's a guy who has such great, all of his successes, but he prepared his people through activities, but at the end of the day, what he really wanted them to focus on was the accomplishments they needed to have. So I think in an accomplishment-based sales coaching, you really start to look at improving, look at the work outputs, start to be collaborative with your rep or with your manager, and I'll get to that in a second, but with your rep, and you start to develop a collaborative, you're looking at practices, exemplary behavior, people who are reaching the very top of that sales thing chart by doing the things correctly, but by managing to their own work outputs and sales milestones. Now, if we can work collaboratively with the person to whom we're coaching, we're able to say, hey, we can move on this, but where do you think you need improvement? How can I help you with that improvement? And this is where we want, this is the work output we want to reach. And that person will agree with you, you'll agree with them, and then you start to build on the behaviors that you need to develop in order to get to that work output.
So what's cool about what you just said is implicit in that is a kind of a diagnostic approach. Instead of just saying, you should do this behavior, it's saying, well, what are you trying to accomplish here? And then let's problem solve it. So it's a very different, it seems to me to be very different. And of course, that's why our coaching approach is very much focused on accomplishments. But right. Thank you for that.
Diagnosing that before you're prescribing, that's exactly right. And just finally, if I have one more second, statistics from DDI did it last year, that 80% of the workforce is managed by frontline managers, and only 75% of those, I think it was even higher, are really well equipped to do that job. you realize what we need to do. If we start to coach the managers on how to really coach the people who work for them, you start to drive performance of everyone, and you take that, as you mentioned, you look at the curve, you start to bring that middle up significantly, which in itself is going to drive business results.
Yep, that's cool. Thank you, John. We could go on and on about this, and it would be fun to do more. But thank you for that. I want to turn to Barbara. Barbara, as I mentioned, is a seasoned sales training and sales performance analyst and consultant, and we've been working, for 20 plus years, and we've been working together on some client projects recently. I guess one of the things that I would ask you, Barbara, because you've seen a lot of stuff out there. You've seen a lot of how people prepare their sales force. And we have this approach, as we've outlined here, which is focused on accomplishments or milestones, and then drives to that, both from a training and coaching point of view, and then all the other things we do for enablement. How would you contrast that with kind of what you've seen at most organizations or other methods?
Yeah, well, a lot of things, probably 3 or 4 off the top of my head. The first is that when traditional training and development organizations or people focus on behavior in sales, particularly with a lot of the clients we've worked with in medical device and some of the examples you've given, there are so many different behaviors, we would probably call tactics, different ways that people can achieve the same work outputs or milestones. So having a good, solid, trusting relationship with a customer or a client is a milestone, right? But there's so many different ways that different people could get to that. So when you're only focusing on behavior and not on the milestones or work outputs, it's really daunting and time consuming to try to organize and identify what all of those behaviors might be or what the right behaviors might be, because really there isn't necessarily a right behavior. There's lots of right behaviors. So that's one thing. Another is our approach has, as you shared, the 6 boxes model. So it's not just training. And in fact, I would argue, and we would all argue, that training by itself is really never the answer. It's when it is part of the answer, it's in combination with other things like setting good expectations with job aids and resources, having the right tools. I know John talked a little bit about tools, having those right tools and systems in place, having the coaching that both of you talked about. So it's really looking at all of the factors that impact and influence the sales performance. So that's the second thing. And then another thing is really just, it's so much easier to measure. When you're focusing on behavior like traditional training and development people do, and it's so hard to measure behavior unless, as a sales manager, you're riding along, like the example you gave, you're riding along with the person and observing their behavior. And as you talked about too, the people don't necessarily behave the same way when their manager is with them than when they're not. So just measuring and counting numbers of milestones, good relationships with clients or customers, the number of good account plans, the number of accurate inventory reports, things like that are so much easier to measure. So yeah, that's really, those are the things I can think of off the top of my head. There's a lot of them.
Well, continuing in that, I talked a bunch about exemplary performers, and I believe it's a myth. People say, well, the top people don't want to share what they do. Maybe they don't want to share everything that they do. But I'm wondering, you and I have engaged in a fair number of interviews, and you've done a bunch of interviews with top people. How do you try to find even those best practices that make a difference? How do you think about that?
Right. Well, first, just having a milestone-based approach helps us find who those top performers are. We can identify who is producing those good outputs or those good milestones as exemplary performers. And sometimes it's somebody who's an exemplar in all of the milestones, but most of the time it's not. It's most of the time someone's good at one thing. Someone might be good at those relationships. Someone else in a medical device or biotech company might be good clinically. So you find the exemplars in each part or each milestone in the sales process. And then you talk to them and you find out, or you observe them. Ideally, you observe them. Now with COVID, we don't get to do that much. And even before COVID, we didn't do that all the time. We just have them in their work environment, if at all possible, to tell us or show us what it is they do to maybe get an introduction to a new customer or something like that. And then we also talk to those average people. So kind of going back to your graph you shared with the upside potential, moving those average people up to the exemplary level or toward the exemplary level, we want to find out what those average people are doing and then look for those differences. And usually we find, some small but very, very important differences between what the very top star performers are doing and what their average colleagues are doing. So that's really the process. And, sometimes it takes just a couple people to talk to and we get what we're looking for. Sometimes it's, a dozen or more of each type of performer.
The cool thing about that, and by the way, I don't know if there's noise at the other end, but without any warning, we have people working on the roof of our office building today. So maybe some weird noise. I apologize for this. Good, I'm glad. But what I was going to say is, following up on that, the idea of identifying those, sort of top people and average people. To give people a sense of what we're talking about, do you have any examples that you could share of kind of these little best practices, kind of things that differentiate top people from average people?
Lots of examples, but I know you only have a couple minutes left, so I'll just give a couple. So with a client that you and I worked with recently, a medical device client, in talking to exemplary people, I'm thinking of one who just had a different way of organizing his calendar, so he was able to see more customers. And that might seem really small and simple, just calendar organized in a certain way versus how the average people organize their calendars. Another one that I can think of is, another exemplary sales rep had, she always found credible reasons to be in the account. So she was there more often than the average colleagues that we talked about. So some examples were, for her, it was generally to go in and do inventory analysis to be in the account, and then she'd have an opportunity to bump into and have conversations with the doctors and other hospital staff that were her customers. So those are two examples I can think of right off the top of my head that were, maybe small things, but made a big difference in their sales performance.
Well, one of the things I love about working with salespeople is they're a highly motivated group of people. They want to win, right? And you mentioned the calendar thing. I've had a lot of people who've done things like, created spreadsheets for themselves that organized, whether it's how they work their territory or based on numbers or whatever, they figure out ways to create tools for themselves that actually make a difference. And you can, if they're willing to share, and they're more often than not, in my experience, you can say, wait a minute, this is really cool. We should do what Jack does. And then you can share that with other people. So that's great. So I appreciate that. So we are running pretty short on time here. I want to see, we've got some resources. You go to our YouTube channel. You can join our LinkedIn thing. You can go to our resource library. We'd love feedback. But I wonder if there are any questions. People have been mostly saying hi and stuff in the chat box. I wonder if there's any questions or comments from any of our colleagues who are participating here. So feel free, if you've got thoughts or questions in the chat box, to add. There's one person in particular that if I don't see any response from in the chat box, I'm probably going to ask, because we have a colleague who is, I guess, retired, Kevin Slaughter. I'm going to call on you, Kevin, just because I don't know if you have any comments to make in the chat box, but Kevin is a long time sales enablement and sales training professional. And I wondered if there's any insights you would share about this. I'm not sure that we can. Oh, actually, Debbie also has a comment. But anyway, Kevin, I see you there. I don't know if you have anything you would like to add, but I'm just looking. Debbie, doesn't the charter need to be connected to the overall GTM strategy? I think that's true. Yes. I mean, John, could you comment on that? You can see Debbie has a question. Doesn't the charter that you were referring to need to be connected to the overall go-to-market strategy?
Yes, I believe it does. And I was talking with one person at a large aviation company, and she was a sales enablement department of one. And the first thing she did was to take, that chart and then align it with that marketing strategy. And then, of course, she'll build a team around that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and it's interesting because as I was mentioning at Product Knowledge Systems, which I headed up for over 10 years, we often were called in because people knew we were really good at accelerating performance.
Yeah.
We'd be called in on big product launches. And there it was all about that. It was all about what we're trying to accomplish, what our strategy is in this marketplace, how we're positioning ourselves relative to the competition, what our guys need to do, what our people need to do to accomplish those milestones. And so it was all lined up. And the ideal is you get everybody in the same room, literally or figuratively, and do that kind of integration. So it's a really good question. Yeah, Kevin has a question too, or comment. How common is it for the performance of enabling functions to be measured based on their products and services that contribute to the sales process? I've seen very little of that. So I think Kevin is asking how often are there connections between the way things are measured and the actual contributions of various sales enablement functions. I think there might be people measuring the effects of some new software, but I don't know what else. And I don't know, I'm wondering if you did any of that at KP, Kaiser Permanente, Kevin, if you guys measured the effects of specific components. And I'm sorry we don't have the opportunity to speak on now, I guess, but you could text anything if you have a response to that. All right. Well, thanks everybody. I think our hour is done, and I don't want to hold people too long. Appreciate your being here. We will, over the next about 24 or 36 hours, be putting this out on our a recording of it out on our YouTube channel, and we will also have a follow-up email to people so that you know how to get to it. I really appreciate your being here, and thank you, Barbara and John, for participating. This was kind of fun. We don't get to be in the same room together, but it's fun to have a conversation in the virtual room. So.
It was. Thanks.
All right. Thank you, everybody. I think we're done then.
Okay.
Thanks.